All right, guys, so welcome to today's episode of Goat Daddy's Farm and Animal Sanctuary. And what we're going to be talking about is goat food. What do you feed your goat from the time they are born until they die? So the first animal that we're going to have to look at is our horses, Smokey and Soldier. So Smokey and Soldier are both horses. Horses eat grass. That is their primary diet. Their body is set up so that they are most comfortable walking around with their head down to the ground. Goats' bodies are set up so that they eat and they are most comfortable eating what is right in front of them. So when you're thinking about feeding goats, never, ever, ever think about lawnmowers or low-down food. They want to browse. They want to eat what's at eyesight, and they want broad-leafed plants. That means plants that have a broad leaf like your clovers or muscadine grapevines, things that occur naturally in nature, not your house plants. Most house plants are highly, highly toxic to them. Azaleas, rhododendrons, things like that are normally toxic to them. So you need to first think about that when you're thinking about where you're going to keep your goats. So now to get to my second point of goats and eating quality hay. So if you look at this right here, many of our customers just have 2 to 5 goats, and they're mainly just pet goats. So they may want to put them in a backyard or a small fenced-in area, and the grass is going to look a lot like this. It may be some weeds like this clover here, and it may be some stuff like this fescue or ryegrass that's popping up. None of this stuff is enough to sustain a goat. They're going to need additional vitamins and nutrients, and also a rotation. So this stuff doesn't do too great in the summertime. It does better in the fall and winter, whereas like your coastal Bermudas do better in the springtime. So even though hay is just grass, it is managed grass. So they normally cut hay when it's 6 to 10 inches long before it goes to seed, which means that there's tons and tons of nutrients in that hay. And as the year goes on, they're fertilizing it and adding the nutrients back to the hay field. Now you can use different types of hay, like your orchard or your Timothy or your coastal, but it is all, no matter what kind, it is all managed to get the prime amount of nutrition out of the soil and into the plant before it's fed to your animal. Just putting them on any piece of land and saying, oh, they've got grass to eat, does not mean that they are going to be able to sustain themselves on that grass. You have to do much more research to that, or you can just take the easy way out, which is what we did. And that easier option is always going to be to purchase horse quality hay. In this instance, a square bale of coastal Bermuda and a beautiful feeding trough for goats, designed for goats. And then as an extra precaution, on top of feeding the hay, we also use grain to feed our goats. Now, it is not always required depending on the type of foliage your goats have, but just to be certain, I always recommend to use some type of grain for all goats. So we have found that with any grain that we choose to feed our animals, the number one thing that I'm looking for is to make sure that it's easily accessible. I don't ever want to have to change the grain again. So we buy it from a local milling company, and we get 1 ton at a time. Now that's normally not feasible for most people if they only have a small number of goats. So I recommend to go to your local feed store like a Tractor Supply or a Rural King and find something that they always have available. One brand that I really like to stick by is Purina Goat Chow. They have a meat goat food that I highly recommend. But you need to be very, very careful with feeding these because they must be fed small amounts at a time, and they must only be fed something that they're used to. If you ever change their food, it has to be changed in, I always tell people, teaspoon amounts. So if you're changing them to a new food, you really need to do it over like a 3-week period, just increasing the new food and decreasing the old food teaspoons at a time. And buy a lot of feed at a time so that you know that you're good, and never, ever, ever let that feed get wet. This is a totally dry, temperature-controlled room, and we keep our grain in these open trash cans so it stays nice and dry, and it's also bagged as well so that we can keep them easily filled. And we know that we are never feeding accidentally pig food to a goat or things like that. Now, for our situation where we have dairy goats, we go through a lot of grain. But if you just have a few goats, then you're likely just using your Purina Goat Chow or something like that. The reason I say the meat maker feed is because the meat maker feed actually has a high amount of ammonium chloride in it. So that is great for wethers, for neutered male goats, to help prevent urinary calculus. Another benefit to it is that it's already formulated. It's never going to be changed at all. It's always the same thing that you're feeding your goat. And it also is full of all the vitamins and minerals designed for a goat. You never, ever, ever want to feed a food that is made for sheep and goats. Things like that, when they're made for multiple species, means that they are not designed for one species in particular. So only ever feed goat food that is made and intended for goats. Get a good quality, keep it dry and clean. Goats are a whole lot more sensitive than most people think, and they do require some strict care to make sure that you never have issues with them. When it comes to goats, you always have to have minerals available. Many people go to the feed store and say, oh, the guy at the feed store told me just to get a mineral block like that. Those are made for cows. Cows and horses have a large enough and rough enough tongue that they can actually absorb the minerals that they need from licking it. However, goats cannot absorb the minerals needed from something like that. They need something like Sweet Lick's loose minerals. Goats cannot absorb the nutrients from a block. I cannot scream that loud enough. Goats have to have loose minerals. So many people get sick goats and they wonder why. And they say, yeah, we have a mineral block in there. They never touch it. Well, that's because they cannot lick enough minerals off of that thing. Their mouth gets tired before they even get a dose of what they need. As you can see, Walnut right here smells his Sweet Lick's Meat Maker Minerals, which is the brand that we have chosen. This is an amazing brand that has helped us with a lot of parasite issues and a whole lot of skin issues as well. It's got high levels of selenium and zinc and copper and all the other stuff that goats need. So I highly recommend this brand, and it's about $30 to $40 a bag, and we have our local feed store order it, but I think you can also order it online. We're not sponsored. Sweet Licks, reach out to us. We love y'all's stuff. Another option, if you're a Tractor Supply shopper, is Manna Pro. Manna Pro comes in an orange bag, and it's also a great feed, but if you start to ever notice skin issues like hair loss or things like that, you probably need to increase the amount of zinc in your goat's diet, and that's easy to do by switching to this meat maker. Either way, they have to have a loose mineral available at all times. All right, so now we're going to talk about one of the most debated things in the goat world, and I swear, if you say something wrong about goat feeding, the whole community will bite your head off. That big debacle is all over baking soda. So this little simple thing right here can save your goat's life. Now, contrary to popular belief, goats do not eat everything. We've already gone over that. So we're doing things like hay and grain to make sure that they have all the nutrients they need to stay healthy. Freya, it's okay if you're in the video. Just come here. Freya, come here, come here, come here, come here. Sit down and look cute. Just look cute. Just look cute. I know it's cold. I know it's cold. We're gonna go right back inside. It's okay. Are you drunk? Oh God, she wants me. Their rumen is like a big fermentation vat. And because of that, if they eat a whole lot of grain, you really want to make sure that they don't get ruminal acidosis. Offering this free choice means that you can prevent ruminal acidosis before it happens. Now, a lot of people will say that things like electrolyte off balances and stuff can happen from that. Every veterinarian I've ever spoken to says that if you are feeding goats grain at all, always offer baking soda. Every vet I've ever spoken to. Let's say that in the springtime, your goats go out and graze on a bunch of lush grass, or a whole bunch of acorns fall in the fall, and they start to get some ruminal acidosis. If they have this available, they're gonna be able to correct that themselves. If a goat starts to bloat, it's already too late. It's very rare that a goat with bloat is gonna be able to get saved, as unfortunate as that is, unless you act quickly. Now, in 9 years of having goats, we've never had to do that because we always keep this available. I highly recommend that everybody get just your regular Arm & Hammer baking soda. We go to our local Sam's Club, and this is made for swimming pools, so you can buy it in a large quantity, and you keep this next to the minerals, and that way they can kind of self-dose with how many they need. So now that we've given you a general idea of how to feed a goat across their lifespan, let's break it down across the lifespan. So feel free to skip ahead to your section, whichever applies to you, or watch the whole video so you're informed throughout their life. All right, so first we're gonna go over goats that are 0 to 6 months old. The first thing I want to say is that any goat 8 weeks or younger, and some larger breeds 12 weeks or younger, have to have some type of milk. We on our farm use cow's milk or goat's milk for our babies, and that's a whole nother video in itself. However, milk also needs to be supplemented as you're weaning with other things. So after a goat is about 6 weeks old, on our farm, they've had 2 CDT shots. The first at 3 weeks, the second at 6 weeks. At that point, we start to introduce small amounts of grain. And when I say small, I mean like a teaspoon or a tablespoon size amount each day for each goat, and let them eat what they will for a few minutes and then remove whatever's not eaten after about 5 minutes. You do not want them to gorge themselves on it. That's how things like enterotoxemia can occur. So our baby goats every 21 days get a dose of what's called toltrazuril, and that eliminates all types of coccidia. It prevents it from ever becoming an issue. And if you have over 2 goats that are babies, I highly recommend you to buy a bottle of toltrazuril for horseprerace.com and give that to your goats, we get the 5% and we give them a dosage of 1 ml per 5 pounds of goat every 21 days up until the time that they are 6 months old. And we have never had an issue with coccidia ever since then. Many people ask us about medicated goat feed. Medicated goat feed is good to feed the mom if the mom is pregnant when you get her, and that helps with reducing the amount, but a person cannot have the milk if the mother goat is on a medicated feed, one, and also the effectiveness of that is very minimal. It does not do much to prevent coccidiosis. Toltrazaril from horseprerace.com, 5% and 1 ml per 5 pounds is highly recommended for every goat under 6 months old. Grain, whatever grain you choose, they need to stay on that grain at a minimum of the first 2 years of their life. But those first 6 months of their life, they need to be getting introduced to grain very slowly. Once you have a goat that is eating grain good, you know that you're off to a good start. Their rumen and their body is going to get all the nutrients that they need from that grain, and they're going to really flourish. As you can see here, these babies were born this past year. They're less than a year old. And we have a Nubian, a mini Nubian, and another mini Nubian. And you can see they are just vigorous and thriving. Where we keep our baby goats at is generally a dry lot, which is an area like this where you can see there's no foliage or anything for them to graze on. But we also sometimes put them on grass. However, they show very little interest in grass. So we introduce a lot of pine tree boughs. Goats love pine trees, and we'll cut down a pine tree and give them some branches off that, maybe some sweet gum, maple, oak trees. All those are great to supplement baby goats with and keep them entertained and enriched, as well as help develop that rumen even further. However, none of those are going to give enough nutritional value to the goat for them to survive on unless they have unlimited quantities. The amount of people who have brought goats to us at that age that are talking about their goats getting skinny or acting weak never, ever, ever would have thought that their goats were starving to death because they're constantly eating. But if they're eating things that are not nutritionally valuable enough, then they're going to lose weight. Even though they're eating, they can still be starving to death. Let's talk about hay for baby goats. Baby goats have to have hay introduced to them, and we introduce it as early as about 3 days because they will start nibbling on whatever they have around them, and we want those things to be good. So we hang the hay in a high feeder, and we make sure that it's either a Timothy or an orchard hay, and we hang it very high. Never alfalfa, as it's super high in calcium and can cause growth issues, especially with wethers or bucks that are going to be weathered later on. So never alfalfa, but we do offer lots and lots of orchard grass hay and Timothy hay. If you can't find the second or third cutting of orchard or Timothy in your area, then buy rabbit hay. It's the bagged hay that you might find at your local pet store, and it comes in a big bag, and offer that to them. Goats really love that, and a lot of goats that have been really hard to get introduced to hay have really loved the bagged rabbit hay. And another trick that we've learned is using Timothy pellets. Just a handful of Timothy pellets with about a quart of water makes a nice powdery mix that the goats really love. Now, it's only good for about 3 hours after you mix it, but that is a really good idea to get goats eating hay and eating that high nutritional fiber source that they really need in their diet. And that's a great diet right there for your goats before they turn 6 months old. So once you get past those first critical 6 months of goat care, the coast is clear as long as you've set a good base for growth for your goats. If they're healthy, they don't have those long skinny looking legs. They've got nice meat and fat pockets along their spine, and they don't look super bloated all the time. Now, some goats, after they eat a bunch of hay or a tree falls, they may look a little fat, but that doesn't mean they're bloated. A bloating goat is on its side screaming. So as long as those first 6 months went really well, then you're going to end up with a goat kind of like we have here. Now, these are our dairy goats. 6 to 24 months old is normally the time that a goat would first be bred. About 8 to 12, really. Some people wait till 18 months to breed their goat. We here do about 18 months and find that works best for us. Now, these girls right here have their head in their mineral and baking soda feeders just about all the time. They love fresh minerals and they love their fresh baking soda. And if they're not eating one of those, they're over here with their head in the hay. So we're going to go take a look at that and talk about the differences between 0 to 6 months and 6 to 24 months and some things that you want to change around that time period. So at 6 to 24 months, you're going to be switching from your high quality Timothy or orchard hay over to your regular coastal Bermuda hay. Now, this is another round bale of coastal Bermuda, and because there's 41 goats in this pen, we have need for more hay, obviously. So we have a cattle panel wrapped up around a round bale, and we remove all that outer plastic covering and store it like this under a cover for them. Now, this coastal is a lot cheaper hay, but it's still really good quality. You don't want to see dust, mold, and it always needs to be kept under a covered area. So think horses. Anything that you buy for your goats needs to be horse quality. If it says cow quality, it's highly likely that it may have burrs and briars, and it may have been stored outside in the rain, which means that entire pockets of it may be rotten on the inside. We always get horse quality everything when it comes to forage for our goats. In addition to being able to switch to the cheaper hay, you can also stop with your Panazaril. A goat that is over 6 months old, it's highly unlikely that it's going to suffer from the effects of coccidia. All goats always have some coccidia parasites in their system, but the amount of coccidia parasites drastically decreases after that immune system starts to kick in. And their immune system really starts to kick in at about that 6-month mark, and their body can defend against those coccidia. So now is the time where you've got to decide what your goats are going to be used for long term. So are you going to have dairy goats? If you're going to have dairy goats, then your goats are always going to be getting some type of grain. If you're going to milk these animals, then whether they're pregnant, they're milking, or they're in between lactations, I would recommend always giving them grain. And the reason for that is if you stop and start in between, then you're risking an upset stomach every time you introduce grain back. And you're also going to have some very upset goats in between that don't really know how to get that additional nutrition that they've been getting this whole time from grain. So that's with your females. Now, if you have wethers or neutered males, then you can decide whether or not you want to switch to just feeding them Timothy pellets, or if they're maintaining their weight on the Timothy and orchard hay, you can just stick with the orchard hay. But in most situations, coastal Bermuda is all that a weathered goat will need. I personally also like to give them that grain, that meat goat grain that we spoke about earlier with that ammonium chloride in it. But many people have successfully been able to keep wethers on just coastal Bermuda, of course, with the loose minerals and plenty of forage as well. And one of the reasons we really like to feed wethers grain is as a treat, just so that they are social. So even if it's just once a day, a little bit of grain is a great way to introduce a lot of nutrition to them, give them any medications you may need, and also keep them very well socialized. But remember, all things in small amount. So this rainbow here also works great, not just for our 2-year-old goats, but for our adult dairy goats. These 3 girls right here are all 3+ years old. And you can see from the size of them, and Mirabella's pink collar, she's actually a retired Nubian doe. And these 2 girls right here are very heavily pregnant. So we need to make sure that they have clean, dry hay that is up high for them to eat at all times. And we also need to make sure that they have grain. So we're gonna go take a look at where they get fed their grain at and how we choose to feed grain to our goats. So most field fencing for goats is your typical 6-inch by 6-inch or 4 by 4-inch welded or woven wire. We like to make one section of all of our fences for our goats wood plank fences. So that's what we've done here. And as you can see, Daphne is up here giving us a good demonstration of how we feed our goats. So whenever we feed our goats, we do not want them to be able to walk, stand, pee, or poop in their feeders. Rain is not that big of an issue as we try to feed in between storms if it is storming. And sometimes if it's just a downpour, we'll skip maybe a morning or evening feeding if it is just a total washout. These feeders right here come from Tractor Supply, and they are great just to clip on the outside, and we put screws in them so that they're evenly spaced and the goats don't mess with them. Some of the feeders we leave the wires in, and I really wish that I had left the wires in all of them. It just helps keep the goat from going side to side so that they can share. But the goats line up shoulder to shoulder and stick their heads through the fence, and we can walk along outside. Not only does it prevent you from being covered in goats every time you walk in the pen or having to fight your way into the gate and getting a bucket dumped in the pen, but it also keeps their food nice and clean. We do drill holes in these feeders so that any water just runs right out. But it is highly important that where you feed your goats grain at, they cannot get to it. So just these simple to build fences work wonderfully. Are you sure we have to include about goats in this? Like the bucks? Are you sure? Are you sure we have to talk about the bucks and what to feed them? I really don't want to. All right, so one of the stinkiest members of our farm are definitely going to be our intact bucks. In this pen, we have 8 intact bucks, and they're the bucks that we use to service all of our beautiful ladies. Now, bucks are quite rambunctious, especially in the wintertime. And as you can tell by my puffy jacket, it is wintertime in South Carolina. So these boys in particular get a little bit crazy because they have a massive pasture, and they also have 8 other bucks in with them. So these guys like to play and fight and run and act absolute fools this time of year. And what that means is they're using a whole lot of energy. So bucks and rut, regardless of what anybody has ever told you, bucks and rut have to have some sort of nutrition. Right. Juana is telling us now that he has to have something. That's what I said. That's what I said. That's what I said. Now I told her And that's what I said. You go tell him. That's what I said. Bucks have to have some type of nutrition. A buck cannot maintain itself during rut off of hay alone. It doesn't matter how good the quality of hay is. So we do choose to feed these guys grain daily, and we do it year round just so there's no upset stomach, and we increase when they're in rut. We feed them the same lactation grain as we feed our does, but our lactation grain, as I said earlier, is formulated specifically for us, and it has a balance of calcium and phosphorus, and we feed a coastal Bermuda hay to these guys. So if you have an intact buck, please remember that they are just as important as your does, and they need grain year round, but especially when they're in rut, you need to make sure that they have plenty of grain. And when I say plenty of grain, that's hard to say a certain amount. For instance, Walnut may need more than his Nigerians. What I try to look at is about how much they can eat in about a 2 to 3 minute period. So we fill up their feeders and we increase it if we put more goats in there, or we decrease it if we take goats away. And we make sure that all the food is gone in about a 2 minute period. Now, if some goats are looking a little skinny, we may increase that amount, or if they're looking kind of fat, we may decrease that amount. There's never a way to go wrong if you learn how to properly grade your goats and tell if they are overweight or underweight. And with goats, looking at the size of their stomach is not the way to do it. You really want to look at the muscle mass and the amount of fat on their body, and that's not on their bellies. Their bellies can change size drastically in just a few hours, depending on if they just ate a bunch of hay or a bunch of forage. You really need to know how to grade your goats, and that also is a whole nother video. And our bucks also get the same high quality horse hay that our girl goats do. They are just as important. They're 50% of having good high quality goats on your farm. I love you, buddy. Alright guys, so a special note that I wanted to say in this video is goats that are in lactation. Every drop of milk that they're producing takes a massive amount of energy going in to put just a little bit of milk out, because they're having to maintain their body and then also produce that milk. If the babies are on the mom and they're nursing from the mom, then they are getting constant supply of fresh raw goat's milk, which is wonderful. However, you have to make sure that mom is being fed good, high quality food. And when our goats are up here, we can milk about 7 goats at a time, and those goats have about 10 minutes of free time to eat every morning and every evening. And you need to be doing the same if you have goats that are in lactation. You cannot be careful enough when it comes to lactating goats. They have to have good, high quality food. They have to have enough of it. And again, learning how to properly grade your goats to make sure that they're not just fat, they're not skinny, they're the proper weight is very, very important. At the end of the day, what goes into your goat is essentially going to determine how happy and healthy they are and how much milk, cheese, or happiness you get from your pet goats. We look forward to providing content for you guys in the future and hope that you will subscribe to our channel and like this video, and maybe drop a comment below regarding what you'd like to see more of around GoatDaddy's Farm and Animal Sanctuary. Thank you guys so much. Peace!